It's high on a mountain, the warm winds are blowing, and where the winds are blowing to, there ain't no way of knowing. The mountain grass is short, it's dry and close to burning, crying out for water as the season's turning. Sweet smell of the pines, tall western cedar, drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river.
Hello, welcome to Unlearn and Rewild, where we explore radical ideas relating to Earth renewal. On this show, we talk a lot about creating a healthy and resilient society. We share tools and methods to restore ecosystems. Today, we're going to turn our exploration inwards and focus on the resilience of our most immediate ecosystem, our bodily vessels. We're joined by Xandria Williams, a renowned naturopathic doctor specializing in cancer prevention and nutrition. Xandria studied chemistry at Imperial College in London. Though she began her career in 1961 as a field geochemist involved in mineral and oil exploration, in 1972 she changed professions and turned to biochemistry and the study of human metabolism, nutrition, naturopathy, herbal medicine, and psychotherapy. She has since headed the nutrition and biochemistry departments at several naturopathic, chiropractic, and osteopathic colleges in Australia and the United Kingdom, and she continues to give lectures to postgraduate students. In addition to appearing frequently on radio and television, Williams has published more than 20 books and 40 articles on physical and mental complementary and alternative medicine. Her recent book, Vital Signs for Cancer Prevention, published by North Atlantic Books, is the result of her many years as a lecturer, writer, and practitioner, and specifically of her own work with people wanting to prevent or needing to recover from cancer. Williams sees clients at her Can Survive Resource Center in London and Ireland, and she conducts long-distance consultations via Skype or telephone. Hello, Xandria, welcome.
Hello, and thank you.
Thank you. So although health takes a backseat in many activist circles, it's critical in our efforts to becoming radically self-reliant and enduring as Earth stewards in this phase of unimaginable challenges and transition. So I'm concerned about the realities of this toxic world. I've never trusted these so-called environmental protection agencies that are really just protecting the corporate right to pollute and trying to convince us that the levels of toxicity we're being subjected to are safe. Our bodies have not evolved to deal with concentrated heavy metals and carcinogens that we're exposed to in this industrial world, and we're seeing cancer rates skyrocket, and innocent people are placing their faith in the medical industrial complex and big agri to sustain them. And on top of that, we're funneling the toxic medications and toxic food into our watersheds and soils, and then when cancers do show up, we douse them with chemotherapy. We've been conditioned, especially in the quote developed world, to believe in some fantastical silver bullet pill or operation to suppress symptoms, which any naturopath will tell you is folly. So according to Wikipedia, a notoriously anti-natural medicine website, it says, quote, naturopathic philosophy is based on a belief in vitalism and self-healing, and practitioners often prefer methods of treatment that are not compatible with evidence-based medicine. Naturopathic medicine is replete with pseudo-scientific, ineffective, unethical, and possibly dangerous practices. It's really disturbing to read that. So I'm wondering, can you give us your analysis of this? And I'm interested to hear what it was like to be a pioneer in natural medicine and how you overcame the forces that are determined to snuff it out.
Wow, that's a big chunk. If you want to go right back, I did a nutrition study while I was doing a master's degree, second degree at Imperial College. As a biochemist, that made a lot of sense to me. I take huge issue with the concept that it's all about vitalism. Huge disagreement with that it's unscientific and not proven. Fundamentally, I'm a biochemist, and all the work that I do is based on evidence-based, proven, PubMed, academic research. There's a huge body of biochemical evidence, research evidence in the medical literature about the benefits of a large number of what we can loosely call natural remedies and plants, substances and the like. It's then as if there's a glass dividing wall between that and the clinical practice that is restricted solely to chemotherapy, surgery and radiation. I got into this back in early 1970s when I was asked to lecture biochemistry in Sydney to chiropractic and osteopathic and naturopathic colleges. I wasn't that interested in chiropractic and osteopathy, but the minute I was teaching to naturopathic students, I thought, gosh, the biochemistry of the body rather than the physics is hugely interesting. And I started lecturing there. Many of the students said, you're much too fierce with the biochemistry, but having met several of them since in various situations, they're very glad for that. Until about the turn of the century, well, until 1996 or so, I was working in Australia in general practice as a naturopathic doctor dealing with all sorts of things. And then I, for various reasons, decided to focus entirely on cancer. Vital Signs is the first of a quintet of books on cancer, of which 2 more are now published and 2 more are in the process. And it is, in a way, it's distressing, it's heartbreaking to see how much benefit people could get from using the alternative approaches or even the complementary approaches. Obviously, they're different. Alternative is when people opt, as many patients do, for a complete change and reliance on their lifestyle and diet. And complementary is when you try and add natural remedies in with chemotherapy and the like. I was at a nutritional cancer conference in Turkey a few years ago. One paper stuck in my mind. The speaker spoke of a histogram showing the results of radiation treatment on its own, and then radiation treatment plus curcumin. And curcumin is a substance, it's the yellow dye, not dye, it's the yellow color in turmeric, that is immensely powerful in cancer. It actually has very specifically well understood impact on specific elements of cellular components called mitochondria, more than that the electron chain, and exactly why it improves the whole situation. And the combination of radiation plus curcumin gave about a 40% improvement in outcome. And yet you'll get oncologists saying, don't take any of that stuff while you're having radiation or the like. One of the points I put across, I hope forcefully, in all of the books, but in Vital Signs starts, obviously, is first you've got to define cancer. Now, the medical profession, by and large, this is sweeping statements, obviously there are rare exceptions, consider cancer to be a tumor. Patients will say, do I have cancer? And the doctor will say, no, you don't have a tumor. So then they say, good, I don't have cancer. But by the time you've got a tumor that can be detected, you've got literally billions of cancer cells. And I don't think you should define cancer as the presence of a tumor versus the non-detection or non-presence of a tumor. Tumor doesn't start overnight. To get that size, it's been growing for a long time. Cancer is a process of biochemical change in the cells that starts maybe 10 years before you get a tumor. The work of Professor Dr. Otto Warburg in the 1925-30s showed that we knew exactly what causes cancer. It is failure of these mitochondria. They're the energy-producing internal organelles within the cell. When they fail, the cell goes back into a sort of fermenting mode that leads to cells multiplying like crazy and causing cancer. So Warburg said the cause of cancer is mitochondrial and oxygen failure inadequacy in the cells, a lack of essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and a lot of things like the polyphenols that are in plants that give us the benefit of vegetable and juices and so forth. Toxins, hugely involved, and stress. And that hasn't changed. Even now, his work is very importantly, fundamentally accurate as to what is starting the cancer process that eventually leads to a tumor. There have been many people since then that have looked at the effect of stress, looked at the stress of nutrient deficiencies, and it all still builds up into the same picture. Professor Biavi in Milan University has done research into cancer and causes. He states that cancer is over 90% caused by lifestyle and diet. Well, diet is part of lifestyle. So your lifestyle is hugely important. And we're exposed to something like 80,000 chemical toxins, as you'd probably know all about with the emphasis of your program. And so many of these interfere with the mitochondrial cellular function and structure that this is behind a large number of the cancers. But the first patient I had in Sydney who had cancer had also a very bad heart. He came to see me. He'd been told he had 4 months to live. He had lymphatic cancer all through his body. This case is written up in Vital Signs because he was so thrilled with the outcome. He insisted on talking to the students, which was very exciting for everybody. He came to see me. He was told he had 4 months to live. And in 1980 odd, what we had to deal with and what we knew, it was minuscule compared to what we have as our tools of today and how much we know today. But he, instead of living for 4 months, lived for 14 years. When he was, I think, about 69, and his heart finally gave out in spite of what we'd been able to do for him till then, that he died. Now, he led what I would call an immaculate life from the first day I met him. And I had reason, before I left Australia, to go visit him and stay for lunch. Yes, of course. Can I help in the kitchen? Yes, of course. What are we eating? Salads, you told us. What oils are we using? Flaxseed, you told us. Where is it? In the deep sea, you told us. What are we drinking? Red clover tea, you told us. He had done every single thing that I had suggested he do. I said, where do you keep the grains and the beans? And he said, oh, in the room temperature fridge, you told us. Well, Australia, room temperature obviously is often 30 degrees, especially in the outback. But what he meant was I'd suggested he keep one fridge above normal fridge temperature, but at the sort of cool room temperature. And he was as fit as a fiddle by then. He was wielding an axe when I called in there, chopping up his own timber. You never underestimate the damage of the environment and the toxins and our lifestyle, and never underestimate the benefit you can get from making all those corrections.
Well, that's a beautiful and very uplifting story. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned the work of Candace Pert, the author of The Molecules of Emotion back in the 90s, and her groundbreaking work set the stage for the field of epigenetics, which is actually being embraced by academia. Essentially, every cell in our body is equipped with receptor sites to receive chemical and energetic information from within our body and from our wider environment. And the brain is constantly sending messages that instruct our body how to act at a cellular level, including instructing our immune system. So can you explain epigenetics as you understand it and tell us how these revelations have influenced your practice?
What she was doing was building a bridge between think yourself well and is that nonsense and voodoo or whatever you like, and solid biochemical metabolic pathways. She was able to show that some of the brain's neurotransmitters, chemical molecules, not only had receptor sites, which is like having your own entry pass into a cell, on the cells of the brain or the nervous system, but she also found them on cells of the immune system, cells of the endocrine system, and eventually cells throughout the body. So what she showed was the body is an interlocking, interconnected network of chemical information. Now, we know much more about that now. We know, for instance, that, I don't know if it's too biochemical, but when you have energy in the body, like in a battery or some such, you have to store it in manageable quanta. You can't just have a hydroelectric power and have all the energy flying out and have it uncontrolled. So when you eat carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, your body breaks it down into smaller and smaller units eventually it goes from the general body of the cell into these very precious and important mitochondria. It comes off in little quanta of energy, and each quanta of energy raises a moderately low level energy molecule called ADP, D for David, to a higher energy ATP, T for Thomas. And it was thought that this came about from the extra bond that was made in the ATP. It was a high energy bond. It's not. It doesn't have much energy, and if it's just released loosely, it is heat. But what we now know and understand in a very interesting book by Nick Lane called Sex, Power and Suicide, I think he says he chose the title to get it sold. It's about the mitochondrial behavior. But what we now know is that this ATP isn't just about energy, it's an information molecule. It's very different to the energy made in the rest of the cells, which doesn't carry energy, but does have the ATP. And this information then affects the way that the cells throughout your body behave. Now, this is really useful and important information. I've been saying, my colleagues have been saying for years, glucose feeds cancer. Cancer cells can only get their energy, in general terms, from glucose. And all the starches you need, all the grains, the beans, the sugars of any sort, fructose, levulose, glucose, dextrose, all of them, convert to glucose. Cancer cells cannot get their energy from proteins or from fats. So a cancer prevention diet should be moderately high protein, moderately high fat, and large amounts of vegetables of all sorts and moderate amounts of fruit. Eaten whole, because the juice is a bit too much sugar all at once. Now, if you starve the cells of cancer, you could starve your cancer, but you actually need a bit of glucose yourself in the form of your vegetables, and you can't completely do that. But the glucose that the cancer cells get and break down in the non-mitochondrial part of the cell, they don't carry information to the rest of the body. So it's doubly important not to give your cells glucose if you're trying to avoid cancer. If you think back to Neolithic times or any such hunter-gatherer times, we had a very low carbohydrate diet. We may have changed somewhat since, our own digestive enzymes may have changed somewhat since, but probably not for the better. The diet in those days was largely any wild living creature they could kill and catch, so largely meat or fish. Poultry maybe, but they're a bit harder to catch if you don't have guns and you haven't got hens running around. And then mainly above ground vegetables. So if you think about it, before we had fire, there wasn't much joy in eating a starchy old root that was pretty tough. So it was largely above ground vegetable diet with loads and loads of plant foods and herbs and all sorts of things. And that's a very good diet. And gradually now people in the general media are coming around to that. Thankfully, we're getting away from the low-fat diet, because if you put somebody on a low-fat diet, what do? They eat lots of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate releases glucose. Glucose feeds cancer. It gives you a little bit of energy that you get without the information, which is where we sort of started off here with Pert's idea. But this is not, going back to your introduction, unproven. It is not without evidence base. All our work with the alternative approaches to cancer, as I finally said to somebody when I was having a fierce argument with 3 doctors over a dinner party in one of my clubs one night, in spite of all the positive things, I said, well, at least, if anything else, at the absolute bottom line, we do no harm. And I said, I totally followed the strictest diet that I would ever put a patient on with fulminating stage 4 cancer. And it's doable. It's difficult, but it's doable. And one of them had the grace to say at the end, well, I actually have to acknowledge, if I got the sort of cancer I treated, I would not take my own medicine. It would be too painful, not worth it. I would sit back in a corner and wait to die. And then she went to work the next day.
Could it be the seasons changing? The winds of winter rearranging all the leaves like fallen queens of sorrow. Could be the freezing rain a-falling, could be sad September calling, or maybe it's the knowing she'll be gone come tomorrow. Well, it's strange how many tortured mornings fell upon us with no warning, looking for a smile to beg or borrow. It's over now, there's no returning, 1,000 bridges sadly burning will light the way I'll have to walk alone come tomorrow.
Talking about the hunter-gatherer diet and the paleo diet that's kind of creating a stir in the media these days, and
yes.
People are arguing that we have to eat meat, it's natural, it's necessary for protein and certain vitamins. But I think about Colin Campbell's China study, and he shows that cancer and other diseases were nearly absent where people ate mainly plant-based foods, and that in lab studies cancer...
But there are several, if I may comment in here. A meat-based diet is fine when it is organic meat, for two reasons. One, if you have regular farmed animals and cattle, you've got a whole lot of hormones, antibiotics, and all sorts of other things in it that you don't want, as well as the pesticides they've eaten from all the grass. If you think about the acres of grass that a cow eats and the amount of pesticides that can be sprayed on that, it's being accumulated down into the piece of steak that a human being eats. So by eating organic meat, you're avoiding all those toxins. Toxins are one of Warburg's 4 solid causes of cancer. On top of that, grass-fed animals, which are the organic ones, not fed the starchy concentrates that are fed to cattle. That grass-fed animal's beef has very different fats in it to the ones in the farmed cattle. They have more unsaturated fatty acids in them, for instance, than the regular ones. It makes a huge difference as to the quality of the meat and the outcome of the individual. And Colin Campbell also talks about, well, two things here. One about an alkaline diet. The idea that you don't eat a whole lot of meat is that many people fry their meat in high temperature fats, which were very dangerous, especially if they've been burnt or crispied or sizzling stir-fried. And many of them are cooked in vegetable oils or margarine spreads, which are hydrogenated fats. It's not just the meat when you get a high meat diet, it's all that goes with it. The best way to cook meat was to make a casserole, to cook it at no higher than 100 degrees centigrade or 212 Fahrenheit. Much safer than the burgers and fries and approach of the present. The other thing about saying to people, don't eat so much meat, if you have a large steak and 4 lettuce leaves on the side, that's not going to work. But if you have a small steak, 3 ounces or so of steak that's been cooked appropriately, and a large salad to go with it, that's a lot better. And the other thing, Colin Campbell, I think in his book, talks about the dangers of milk. The problem with milk is one of the proteins in it. There's fat-soluble protein in milk called casein, and there's water-soluble proteins in the milk that land up in the whey, which is the liquid when you make the cheese. Because they're water-soluble, they stay in the liquid whey. The casein protein is the problematical one, so milk and cheese are problematical. The whey protein is safe enough. And so things like yogurt, where you've changed the protein, I can't quote any study I've ever seen that says that making milk into yogurt changes the casein into a smaller protein and molecules that are not casein any longer, but I suspect that that's likely. So whey protein, whey liquid, yogurt are okay. Cream is all right, because cream, particularly the really thick cream with little liquid left, milk solids left in it, is largely fat. And it's useful fat. Butterfat is a very useful fat, and some of it, butyric acid, feeds the brain. Casein, there are chemical studies in the scientific literature where they're trying to give rats or mice cancer and then study the effect of drugs. And if the cancer is not developing fast enough, they feed the rats a diet of 20% casein, which turns on the cancer. So, yes, be careful of milk, but follow the ideas that I've given you. The other problem with milk, of course, is that many people are weaned onto non-human milk too soon. They get sensitivities, allergies, whatever you like to call it, to those. And for those people, perhaps any sort of milk's a problem.
And where does a person's personal metabolic type play into this?
Very important. William Kelly, a dentist in Texas, he had cancer. He had tumors. By the time they took his illness seriously, they'd said, "You're actually too ill to operate now. Sorry, we didn't notice this before." You know, they'd been telling him it was all in his mind and he should go home and get unstressed. He had tumors in his lung, liver, pancreas, which of course is the worst one, and somewhere else in his middle abdomen. And he was 37 at the time. They said, "Well, go home and write your will." He died when he was 79, 40-some years later. And he developed that some of his patients did well on a high-meat diet. Some did much better on a very low-meat, high-vegetable diet. And then another chap, William Walcott, who's, I think, now in Washington, Seattle, I think, and has a metabolic typing website. He said, well, yes, there are fast and slow oxidizers. There are also parasympathetic and sympathetic dominant. So think of it like a north-south, east-west axis. East-west, you have the fast, slow oxidizers. North-south, you have the sympathetic or parasympathetic dominant. People who are sympathetic dominant or slow oxidizers do much better on a vegetarian and fish diets, generally speaking. And people who are fast oxidizers or parasympathetic dominant do much better on a high meat, low grains, moderate vegetable and fruit diet. I'm not sure what the statistics are numerically, but it's said that the slow oxidizers and sympathetic dominants tend to get cancer more often than the other two groups. And they're the two groups that do better on a very high vegetable diet. And so you can see why giving everybody a high vegetable diet gets a better outcome than giving everybody a high meat diet. Obviously, it's even better if you determine which is their type and which they should follow. You've got to eat for what your body best can utilize. Take the parasympathetic, sympathetic dominant. Parasympathetic dominants put a lot of their energy on digesting food. So they can digest a big chunk of meat, which is hard to digest. Give them a salad and they've digested it in 5 minutes. They're hungry in 10 minutes, and in 15 minutes they're telling you you don't know what you're talking about. Give a sympathetic dominant a high steak diet and they'll say, oh, I don't feel good on this. I feel like a ton of lead inside me. And it's by understanding the physiology that actually relates to the metabolic type, the pattern of the way the body behaves, that allows us to help people with cancer or who want to prevent cancer to get the best health they can. The whole work of everything I do isn't treating cancer. I don't treat cancer, I treat people. And the aim is to restore homeostasis, restore normal, healthy function. Take away all the toxins, give the person everything they need. And whereas the doctors will say, oh, yes, but that all sounds very simplistic and there's no science behind it, there's an immense amount of science behind it and a huge amount of power behind the benefits that accrue from it.
We live in an age of ubiquitous nuclear pollution, and eating lower down the food chain will theoretically limit your exposure to radiation, since animals bioaccumulate radioactive particles.
Sure.
Here in the U.S., Pacific seafood is testing positive. Beef that are eating polluted grass are testing positive, but our EPA has set the safe level of cesium to 1,200 becquerels per kilo, which is outrageous, and testing is grossly inadequate. So how does this affect our decision about eating fish or meat, and is there any safe meat anymore?
I think if you can get truly organic meat from farms that have been organic for a long time, that's the best you can do. You can't stop the fact that you live in the 21st century. So you've got to do the best you can and then stop fretting. If there's more you can do, do it. But if there's no more you can do, stop fretting, because stress isn't going to help either. Stress cuts down the circulation, that cuts down oxygen to the tissues, and we're back to Warburg first, cause of cancer. And actually, while we're on Warburg, it's worth pointing out that even all the genetic cancers, so-called, many of those genetic changes and mutations come about because of the changes in the cell at the mitochondrial level that Warburg spoke about. But the thing is, get the very best quality diet you can get. I mean, there's so many supplements around now. There's green powders, red powders, blue powders, which are simply all the red and blue fruits and berries dried, and you can get all the concentrated polyphenols. We know so much now about the biochemistry of the things you can take, resveratrol, for instance, and ellagic acid and quercetin, and the list is endless. But we can also do tests. I mean, one of the tests that one of your excellent laboratories in Florida does will, according to Dr. Emil Schandl, who runs the laboratory and has done so for 20 or more years, he says pick up cancer within maybe 10 weeks of when it first starts, maybe 4 or 10 years before there's a tumor. If everybody did that test and saw that, we're beginning along the cancer process, we better change our lifestyle, you could save an enormous amount of expense in the medical field. But, at one level, not being too cynical, I hope, the medical hierarchy, the multinational drug companies and the right, I don't think they even want a cure for cancer. It's a brilliant milk cow for them. They've got a disease that people will raise money for in huge charity organizations, feeding the companies and the company shareholders, for a disease that no matter what they do doesn't really improve lifestyle that long. There was a big meta-study done in Royal North Shore Hospital in Sydney, Australia, I think at the beginning of this century, about 2002, looking at American and Australian results for the improvement in 5-year survival of people with cancer who had simply had chemotherapy. Meta-study being taking all of the studies that they could find across the world, normalizing them for all the variables. The improvement in 5-year survival from chemotherapy alone in America was 2.1% and in Australia 2.3%. 2% for the immense amount of agony and harm that people go through. And yet here and also in America, those of us who advocate alternative therapies were more likely to be hounded. William Kelly, the dentist I spoke of, was subjected to your FBI going in, taking out all his computers, all his files, closing him down. He had to go and work in Mexico. Dr. Gonzalez in New York, he was with the Sloan Kettering Institute, and for one of his near graduation or student projects, one of his supervisors said, well, why don't you go down and look at this William Kelly chap and see if these stories that we're hearing about him are true. Well, Gonzalez is, like me, a pretty straight line test. He wants proof, he wants numbers, he wants outcomes. He's not going to take a few anecdotal stories. He went down and spent time with Kelly. Kelly said he had at that stage about 3,000 patients. He was a dentist, but of course everybody in his hometown knew his story and started going to him whenever they knew anybody with cancer. Gonzalez found that Kelly had 22, I think it was, patients with biopsy-proven pancreatic cancer, proven by the Mayo Clinic or the Anderson Clinic. 5 that were absolutely incontrovertible pancreatic cancer. Gonzalez, going through Kelly's reports, case reports, found that something like 8 or so of the patients said, oh, I couldn't do your therapy. No, I couldn't give up all my food. No, I can't take all the tablets. Their lifespan, average lifespan from diagnosis, was about 2 months. Another 8 or so out of those 22, the exact numbers are in my book, but this will do. They sort of said to Kelly, well, we can do some of it. You know, we could take some tablets, or we could change our diet, or we could do the detoxing and the enemas and the liver flushes, or we could do a bit of things. And their average lifespan was about 5.5 months. 5 of them did everything Kelly had done. And when Gonzalez wrote that workup, they were all alive, and their average lifespan was 9 years. Now, if that had been a medical study, you think of the headlines that would have made. One of the people of those 5 actually wasn't alive. He'd lived 11 years, and then he had been put into a retirement home. He got old, and of course in a retirement home, they wouldn't let him continue the therapy. So effectively, everybody on that study was done brilliantly well. But it's not wanted. Right. You can't sell these ideas to a government on the idea of saving money and pain and hardship. They're government, multinational run.
Right. You had mentioned that we live in a toxic world, and regardless if the toxins or the radiation comes from the meat, we're all increasingly being exposed to ionizing radiation. So what does an effective detox program look like for radiation or for your typical urban pollution, heavy metals and such?
I think if you're looking at a detox program, you don't want to look at, let's deal with radiation, or let's deal with water pollution, where all the hormones like estrogen are from the women on the contraceptive pill, flushing them down into the water supply, and so forth. I think you need to take a really holistic view, but your whole lifestyle needs to be anti-toxin. So you need to look at good quality food, not taking in toxins, looking at the toxins in the cosmetics, the hair colors, dyes, shampoos, the toiletries, the perfumes, the sprays around the house, the oven cleaners, the fly sprays. I mean, we actually make many homes far more toxic than the outside world and far more dangerous than some of the radiation that we're exposed to. We need to do things like cutting down on electromagnetic smog, if you like, all the mobile phones and the Wi-Fi networks, and use cable where you can. Don't stick on your mobile phone. There's books on this. There's a whole big chapter in Vital Signs on toxins, but also particularly on detoxing and getting rid of them. You want to detox your body and stop taking in the toxins.
We're here with Xandria Williams, a naturopath and expert in cancer treatment and prevention. So Xandria, I wanted to get your take on supplements. Supplements are great, except they're increasingly made in China, they often contain GMOs and fillers, and they can be pretty expensive, and there, can be a lot to stay on top of.
They're often made all over the place, but you can find really good ones. And I am a great enthusiast for the food-derived supplements. Now, there's two types of food-derived supplements. You can say, oh, mine's a food-derived vitamin C, and you hope that it's a mixture of powdered amla berry and rosehip and all the other acerolas and vitamin C-rich plants. And if it is, that would be great. And if you get it as a powder instead as a tablet, you don't get the fillers and binders. Second to that, if you get them in non-gelatin vegetable capsules, then you're cutting out some of those supplements. But you can also take a food like corn, break it down to glucose, convert the glucose into vitamin C. There's only a very slight difference in the structure, and that's one enzyme that we lost when we evolved beyond the four-legged animals. You can still call that a food-derived vitamin because it was first made from corn, but by a huge chemical process. So you need to look into that. And there are companies these days that are focusing on the really good quality supplements. Remember what I said right the way back to that chap in Sydney who had lymphatic cancer all the way through. We didn't have all those supplements then. We didn't have the tests that American metabolics do in Florida. He lived an immaculately pure diet. He certainly did go out to Sydney. He lived on, a square mile of territory or something of that sort, one of these big out west properties. He started growing his own vegetables hydroponically. It's another thing I'd suggested, and he did it, and he kept doing it. You can do a lot of these things without all of today's modern tests or without all today's modern supplements, perhaps. But on the other hand, 1980s, 34 years ago, were a lot less toxins around then. So we're very lucky these days to have all the skills we've got. I run 2 panels of tests on patients, one in America, and then the second test panel is run by a laboratory here, Galkina Laboratory in southern England. The first one will pick up cancer, I spoke about it earlier, within weeks of it forming. The second one will tell me a lot about the characteristics of a patient's cancer. If her body is producing, for instance, too many blood capillaries, we know that's growing blood vessels to feed the growing tumor. We have a plant remedy that will stop those capillary growths completely. We know it will, because if they have a cut, it'll heal more slowly. So with those 2 tests, we can actually target what we're doing. And it's one of the benefits we've got alongside all the increased pollutants we've got. But both those sets of tests are very well worth doing. The first one is interesting because a Dr. Beard in the UK here, he was in England and Scotland and Germany for a bit, 1905, 110 years ago, identified the cancer cells and the placental cells as being identical. Not similar, not like. He said when a woman is pregnant, at the start she has cancer. And if you think about it, the placental cells do exactly what a tumor does. It invades the uterine wall. Now, that's not an easy thing to do for a little morula of about 16 cells that would normally be swept away every month. It's got to break through this hugely strong uterine wall, and it's then got to force a blood supply and stop the immune system fighting it off. These are all things that the cancer cell does successfully, and they're all, when it metastasizes especially, they're all things the placental does. What Dr. Beard in 1905 found out, until this point he was being considered for nomination for a Nobel Prize. Once he discovered this and made it public, he was rubbished as an idiot. He died a miserable man, sadly, unrecognized. But if people had listened to that, our whole health history would have been different. Because what he found was that on day 55 of the pregnancy, the embryo's pancreas started working. Now that seems ridiculous, because the pancreas deals with digestion, and the little embryo is not digesting anything, mother's supplying the food, and it balances blood glucose level. And the little embryo doesn't have to do that. Mother's doing it. But what the little embryo is doing by producing pancreatic activity is producing the enzymes, trypsin, chymotrypsin, and amylase, that are capable of halting the cancerous activity of the placenta. And what he did, and what Kelly and Gonzalez and a lot of other people now are doing, like as I do too, is working with a lot of pancreatic extracts so that these pancreatic enzymes can attack a tumor. Having Candida is one of the risk factors for cancer. It interferes with so much going on in your body. It changes sugars into the alcohols and aldehydes, the thing that causes a hangover feeling in alcohol consumption. It interferes with the absorption from your gut. It interferes with the microorganisms in the digestive tract that you need for good health. It's massive. So many people say things like, oh, well, it's not too bad, I can stand it. Well, you don't say your car's making a noise and the engine's thumping, but it's not too loud, and if you put earplugs in, you can keep driving. You fix it. People with any of those problems should get them fixed at once. By the time they are noticeably bad, they're doing a lot of harm. Mercury fillings in your teeth are harmful. They encourage candida. Mercury encourages candida. Root canals are even worse. At one conference I was at in the States on cancer, one of the oncologists in the alternative field said he wouldn't even treat his patients if they didn't get all their root canals out. He said, I'd be tied with one hand behind my back. It's just not worth it. I've got patients who'll do everything I suggest and work wholeheartedly. But you do have to check out the people you believe. And people still, you talked about a white magic bullet at the beginning. People still think, well, there must be just a pill to fix it. And there isn't. Cancer's a lifestyle situation. Getting it's a lifestyle situation. Resolving it is the opposite lifestyle situation. But this you can advise people on by phone or anywhere in the world. So people can get help if they're willing to do it. If people will do, the people in this country, well, my patients in this century since I started on this field, who've done everything I've said, have survived. But some people say, well, I ate less sugar, but or I can't take all those pills and so forth. Well, two things I say to patients. Tell me what your budget is, because there's no point in me telling you things that are costing a fortune and you'll be broke. And tell me how much you're willing to change, because there's no point in me telling you this is the ideal way to live and you saying, can't possibly do that, I have to have sandwiches for lunch or something of this sort. But within those parameters, you can then create a protocol that'll give them the best possible chance. Obviously, the more they will do, Kelly lived his whole life, the dentist lived his whole life, he says, on the therapy that he programmed with his clients.
Another magic bullet we hear about a lot is energy drinks or coffee for this chronically fatigued society that we're living in. And then, you top it off with stress and sugar, and this all leads to adrenal exhaustion, which can in turn encourage cancer. So what is adrenal exhaustion, and how do we treat this chronic fatigue?
Hans Seeley developed the idea of stress. He didn't understand English well enough. He was Hungarian. He should have used the word strain. If you think about it, if something stresses you, your body is strained. If you stress a metal, it experiences strain. So we are faced with a lot of stresses. The strain that we feel is a measure of how bad that stress is. Normally, back to the Paleolithic days, if you like, you would be stressed running from lions and tigers, and then you'd come back to the cave and rest and recover. We don't do that now. We work away at it. We keep going. We go from the alarm stage of stress to the second stage, to the third stage, the exhaustion stage. And we live on biochemical capital, if you like. As a little kid, you've got loads of adrenal function and everything else. When you stress like mad, you're on a low-quality diet, you don't get the B vitamins, you do all the things that fail to feed the adrenal glands, they become exhausted. There's a Dr. Fryda, F-R-Y-D-A. She's died now. I had the privilege of a meeting and seminar with her when she was 82. She worked and wrote a small booklet on stress as a significant cause of cancer, one of Otto Warburg's 4, and showed that the adrenal exhaustion led to low levels of adrenaline, which leads to reduced capillary beds, which leads to a lack of oxygen to the tissues, which causes the cells to ferment and become cancerous. So psychotherapy becomes, again, this is the fourth of Warburg's 4 points, psychotherapy sessions become really important. If you can't change the stress in your life, you can change this level of strain you'll let your body develop as a response to that stress. Some people would be terrified of speaking in public, let's say. I quite enjoy lecturing and speaking in public, but put me on a beach with nothing to do for a day and I'd be stressed out of my mind. I'd be bored and frustrated. Give me a biochemical textbook and I'll read it in bed until the lights fell. So it's your response that you can change. If you can change the stressors in your life so you're not so strained, change them. You know, if you're in a job you hate, try and get a better one. If you can't, find ways to make it better. And if you say you can't, well, okay, then you better take drugs because, you know, for you to change, things to change in your life, you have to change. Mm-hmm. And we're back to the lifestyle aspect of it. There was more, I think, in the question you asked then, but I forget what that was. You asked about adrenals.
The chronic fatigue, that seems to be a large...
Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing. Chronic fatigue, I wrote a book on fatigue 20 years ago. And it's simply not giving the body, the petrol, if you like, the energy it needs to function properly. And it's an overload of... it's also called post-viral stress syndrome. It's, you know, there's toxins, there's viruses, there's lack of nutrients. When you really come down to it, avoiding so many health problems comes down to fully repairing, normalizing the way the body functions, giving it what it needs and removing the toxins. But it's not just airy-fairy. I keep stressing this. The biochemistry is well understood. We know exactly how things are having an impact. The more we learn, I'd lectured in Sydney, in the early mid-1980s, when naturopathy, which is there, it's like being a general medical practitioner. It's much more respected than here in the UK. But I was giving a talk, and there were, for one of the big vitamin companies, to a whole lot of practitioners. And there were 2 chaps there, about 60 plus each. And the organizer, who was fairly biochemically enthusiastic and knew a bit what I was talking about, came up to them afterwards when I was near them and they said, well, what did you think of that? Thinking they would say, oh, yeah, a load of modern stuff. We've just been giving these herbs and we get results. Not a bit of it. They said, oh, no, that was a very interesting talk. She's just proven what we knew all along. And there's a lot in that. More and more we learn, the more we're validating what have been the alternative options for decades.
To slow down and really figure out how to support ourselves and take care of ourselves in the face of this world that we're living in now with the stress and the toxicity is such an important way of understanding our health.
It's a bit like computer operators say to each other, garbage in, garbage out. You put the wrong program information in, you get rubbish out. Put the wrong food in the body, you're not going to get a healthy body out of it. Mm-hmm.
And again, what was your website for our listeners?
It's Xandria Williams. It's spelled Xandria Williams, WILLIAMS.co.uk. And I'm happy to, answer questions or do consultations by phone or Skype, or people could get, if they look at the website, they'll see I've written about 20 books and 400 articles. They'll see them on the website and they can order them from most bookstores or Amazon or whatever.
Wonderful.
But I'm also very happy because I've had a long and thrilling career, but I'm really keen, particularly now, to train the practitioners as much as anything else, to help people who want to really learn how to deal with this in practice. I do two things with patients. I have fixed consultations like anybody would have, but I also say they can pay a fixed fee for a year, and then they can phone me up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with queries. Doesn't replace consultations, but because cancer is such a lifestyle thing, someone's in a shop somewhere, oh, should I buy this or buy that? Or I was doing this enema detox and here I am on the bathroom floor and I'm not quite sure whether I should do this or that. So you want to sort of be holding their hands through it. Medical profession rather says, go see this specialist, go see that specialist. You're never quite sure how it all comes together or who to phone when you've got a problem. So some people can phone up, they pay either for a year or they pay about 2/3 of that, I think, for 4 months, because you mostly use it in the first 4 months, because by then you've more or less got your feet under you. But I'm really happy to help and I'm happy to share it.
Well, thank you for your work and your care of people. It's an incredible thing to meet you and discuss these very important ways of healing.
No bad side effects at all. That's half the battle.
You just feel better and stronger and more energetic.
Absolutely.
Drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river, sweet smell of pines, tall western cedar. Drifting on the wind through the mountains like a river.
Thank you for listening to Unlearn and Rewild, and many thanks to our producer, March Young. Today we heard Townes Van Zandt singing Come Tomorrow, and a funky little number called Pollution by Pieces of Peace. And our theme song is Like a River by Kate Wolf.
Through the mountains like a river.